The bread was still warm in Sarah Anderson's trembling hands when she heard the heavy footsteps on the porch behind her. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the stolen loaf to her chest, the crust rough against her fingers, the scent of fresh wheat making her empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. 3 days. 3 days since she had eaten anything more substantial than the bitter bark tea she had been choking down to quiet the gnawing ache in her belly. The footsteps stopped. Sarah pressed herself against the rough log wall of the cabin, her bare feet silent on the weathered planks, every muscle in her body coiled like a spring ready to snap. The September wind cut through her threadbare dress, raising goosebumps along her arms and legs, but she barely felt the cold. All she could focus on was the terrible silence stretching behind her, broken only by the whisper of pine needles in the mountain breeze and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. She had been so careful, so quiet. The mountain man, the Damish man who lived in this isolated cabin, had been chopping wood behind the house when she crept up to his porch, drawn by the smell of fresh baking that had drifted down the mountainside to where she had been hiding in the trees. She had watched him for nearly an hour, noting the rhythm of his axe, the way he paused every few minutes to wipe the sweat from his brow, the steady, methodical way he split each log with practiced efficiency. Brandon Wright. She had heard his name whispered in the valley below, always with a mixture of fear and respect. The hermit of Copper Ridge. The man who lived alone in the wilderness, who came to town only twice a year for supplies, who spoke to no one and trusted even fewer. Some said he was dangerous, others claimed he was simply broken, a man who had retreated from the world after losing everything that mattered to him. Sarah had never cared about the stories. She had her own ghost to wrestle with, her own reasons for avoiding the curious stares and pitying whispers of the townspeople. But now, standing frozen on his porch with his bread in her hands, she found herself wondering if the darker rumors might be true. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, as the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing, tried to think past the panic that was threatening to overwhelm her. She could run. The forest was thick here, full of places to hide, and she knew these mountains better than most. She had been living rough in the wilderness for weeks now, ever since the bank had foreclosed on her family's farm, and she had found herself with nowhere else to go. But running meant leaving the bread behind, and the bread meant survival for another day or two. It meant the difference between the slow, grinding agony of starvation and the strength to keep searching for work, for some way to pull herself back from the edge of desperation that had been her constant companion since her father died and left her alone in the world. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. The footsteps resumed, slow and deliberate, moving around the side of the cabin. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her body tensing as she realized he was circling around to cut off her escape route. She pressed herself flatter against the wall, her heart racing so fast she was afraid he might hear it, might sense her presence through the thin barrier of logs and mortar that separated them. She thought of her father then, of the way he had looked at her in those final days when the fever had taken hold, and he knew he was dying. The regret in his eyes had been almost unbearable. The knowledge that he was leaving his only child to face the world alone, with nothing but a failing farm and a mountain of debt. To her name. "I raised you to be strong," he had whispered, his voice barely audible above the rattle in his chest. "Stronger than your mother, stronger than me. Whatever comes, Sarah girl, you survive. You hear me? You do whatever it takes, and you survive." The memory gave her courage, or perhaps it was simply desperation that made her push away from the wall and take a careful step toward the edge of the porch. The bread was a solid weight in her hands, more precious than gold in her current circumstances. She would not give it up without a fight. But as she reached the corner of the cabin, she found herself face to face with Brandon Wright. He was larger than she had expected, broader across the shoulders and taller by nearly a foot, his dark hair hanging loose around a face that spoke of too many winters spent in solitude. His clothes were simple but well-made, practical garments suited to a life lived in the wilderness. And his hands, she noticed, were steady and calloused from years of hard work. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and unreadable, and they held a depth of pain that she recognized because she carried something similar in her own chest. This was not a man who had chosen isolation lightly. This was someone who had been driven to it by circumstances beyond his control, just as she had been driven to theft by hunger and desperation. They stared at each other for a long moment, neither moving, neither speaking. The wind rustled through the pines around them, carrying the scent of approaching rain and the distant promise of winter. Sarah became acutely aware of how she must look to him, this strange woman on his porch with her tangled hair and hollow cheeks, clutching his bread like a lifeline. "You're hungry," he said finally, and his voice was rougher than she had expected, as if it had been too long since he had used it for conversation. Sarah lifted her chin, meeting his gaze despite the shame that burned in her chest. "Yes. How long since you've eaten?" The question was asked without judgment, without the condescension she had grown accustomed to from the townspeople who looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. It was simply a request for information, delivered in the same tone he might have used to ask about the weather. "3 days," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon nodded slowly as if this explained everything he needed to know about her presence on his porch. His eyes moved over her face, taking in the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her dress hung loose on her frame. She forced herself not to look away, not to show the vulnerability that was eating at her from the inside. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah Anderson." Recognition flickered in his eyes, and she realized he must have heard about her family's troubles, about the foreclosure and her father's death. News traveled fast in the small communities scattered throughout these mountains, carried by traders and trappers, and the occasional drifter looking for work. "You're Thomas Anderson's daughter." "I was." The past tense hung between them like a physical thing, heavy with all the loss and grief she had been carrying since the day they lowered her father into the ground. She had been truly alone since that moment, cut adrift from everything familiar and safe, forced to navigate a world that seemed determined to crush anyone who showed the slightest sign of weakness. Brandon studied her for another moment, then stepped back, gesturing toward the door of his cabin. "Come inside." Sarah hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run. She knew nothing about this man beyond the rumors and stories, had no reason to trust him beyond the fact that he had not yet tried to take the bread from her hands or drag her down to the valley to face whatever passed for justice in these parts. But the alternative was returning to the cold, damp cave where she had been sheltering, to spend another night listening to her stomach growl and wondering how much longer she could survive on roots and berries and the occasional fish she managed to catch in the mountain streams. "Why?" she asked. "Because you're hungry and I have food." It was such a simple answer, delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty, that it took her off guard. She had grown so accustomed to complexity, to the web of obligations and expectations that governed every interaction in civilized society, that she had almost forgotten such straightforward generosity was possible. "I can't pay you," she said. "Did I ask you to?" Sarah looked down at the bread in her hands, then back up at his face. There was no mockery there, no hidden agenda that she could detect. Just a kind of weary acceptance, as if taking in strays was something he did regularly, though she suspected from his reputation that nothing could be further from the truth. "I don't understand," she said. "What's to understand? You're hungry, I have food. It's not complicated." But it was complicated, at least for her. She had been raised to believe that everything came with a price, that charity was just another form of debt, and that accepting help from strangers was the first step on a path that led to places she didn't want to go. Her father had been a proud man, sometimes too proud for his own good, and he had passed that pride on to his daughter, along with his stubborn streak and his tendency to see the world in terms of black and white. "What do you want in return?" she asked. Something flickered across Brandon's face then, too quick for her to identify, but it might have been sadness. Or perhaps it was simply recognition of a kindred spirit, someone else who had learned through bitter experience that the world was not a place that offered something for nothing. "Nothing," he said. "At least nothing you're not willing to give." The ambiguity of the statement should have worried her, but somehow it didn't. There was something in his tone and the way he held himself that suggested he was as wary of human connection as she was, as reluctant to impose his will on another person as she was to submit to someone else's demands. "I stole your bread," she pointed out. "I noticed. Aren't you angry?" Brandon considered this question seriously, tilting his head slightly as he studied her face. "Should I be? You took what you needed to survive. Seems reasonable to me." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and shame that had been her constant companion for so long. She could not remember the last time someone had spoken to her with such casual acceptance, without judgment or expectation, or the kind of false sympathy that was somehow worse than outright hostility. "Most people would be angry," she said. "Most people haven't been where you are." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Brandon Wright knew something about desperation, about the choices a person made when survival was the only thing that mattered. She wondered what had driven him to this isolated existence, what losses he had suffered that had made him retreat from the world of human connection and community. "Come inside," he said again, and this time she found herself nodding, following him through the heavy wooden door bar into the warmth of his cabin. The interior was larger than she had expected, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and shelves lined with books and practical supplies filling the others. The furniture was simple but well crafted, obviously made by hand, and everything was clean and organized with the kind of precision that spoke of a man who had learned to depend entirely on himself. The smell of fresh bread was stronger here, mingling with the scent of wood smoke and something else she couldn't quite identify. Coffee, perhaps, or the herbs he must use for cooking. It was a comfortable smell, homey in a way that made her chest tight with longing for things she had lost. Brandon moved to the fireplace where a pot was hanging over the coals and ladled something into a wooden bowl. The smell that rose from it made Sarah's mouth water, despite her nervousness, and she realized it was some kind of stew, thick with vegetables and what might have been venison. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a chair near the table. Sarah remained standing, still clutching the bread, still poised to run if the situation took a turn she didn't like. "I should go." "Where?" The question stopped her cold because she didn't have a good answer. Where would she go? Back to the cave that barely provided shelter from the elements? Back to wandering the mountains, growing weaker each day, until she collapsed somewhere and became food for the scavengers? "I have a place," she said, but even she could hear the lie in her voice. Brandon set the bowl on the table and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. "No, you don't." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact, delivered with the same matter-of-fact certainty he had shown throughout their conversation. Sarah felt her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble, and she had to fight the urge to break down completely, to confess everything about her desperate circumstances and throw herself on his mercy. Instead, she lifted her chin and met his gaze. "What makes you so sure?" "Because if you had a place to go, you wouldn't be stealing bread off my porch." The logic was unassailable, and Sarah felt the last of her pretense slip away. She was tired of lying, tired of pretending she had everything under control, when the truth was that she was barely surviving from one day to the next. "Fine," she said. "I don't have anywhere to go. Are you satisfied?" "I'm not trying to humiliate you," Brandon said quietly. "I'm trying to help." "Why?" It was the same question she had asked before, but this time she put more weight behind it, more of her genuine confusion and wariness. She had learned not to trust offers of help, especially from men, especially when she was in a position of weakness. Brandon was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if the flames might provide him with the answer she was looking for. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost contemplative. "Because someone helped me once when I needed it, and because," he paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully, "because I know what it's like to have nowhere to go." There was a story there, Sarah realized, a history of loss and displacement that paralleled her own in ways she was only beginning to understand. But she also sensed that it was not a story he was ready to tell, just as she was not ready to share the full extent of her own circumstances. "Sit down and eat," he said, turning back to face her. "We can figure out the rest later." Sarah looked at the bowl of stew, at the chair he had indicated, at the man who was offering her kindness without apparent expectation of reward. Every rational part of her mind was screaming warnings, reminding her of all the ways this could go wrong, all the dangers inherent in accepting help from a stranger. But she was so tired of being afraid, so exhausted by the constant struggle to survive, that she found herself moving toward the table almost without conscious thought. She set the bread down carefully, as if it were made of precious metal, and lowered herself into the chair. The stew was the best thing she had tasted in months, rich and savory, and filling in a way that made her realize just how close to the edge she had been. She tried to eat slowly to maintain some semblance of dignity, but her body betrayed her, demanding fuel with an urgency that overrode her social conditioning. Brandon watched her eat without comment, his expression unreadable. When she finally looked up from the empty bowl, she found him studying her with what might have been concern. "Better?" he asked. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The simple act of eating a proper meal had done more than just fill her stomach. It had reminded her what it felt like to be human, to be cared for, to exist as something more than a desperate animal focused solely on survival. "Thank you," she managed. "You're welcome." The silence that followed was comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind in the trees. Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks, her body settling into the chair as if it remembered what it felt like to be safe. But the peace was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats outside, multiple horses moving at a fast pace up the mountain trail. Brandon's head snapped up, his entire body going tense, and Sarah felt her own muscles coil in response to his obvious alarm. "Expecting company?" she asked, though she could already see from his expression that he wasn't. "No," Brandon said, moving to the window and peering out through a gap in the curtains. "And company doesn't usually come this far up the mountain unless they're looking for trouble." Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized what this might mean. Someone had seen her, had followed her trail up the mountain. Someone was coming for her, and she had led them straight to the man who had shown her kindness. "I should go," she said, starting to rise from the chair. "Stay put," Brandon said, his voice sharp with command. "Running now will only make things worse." But Sarah was already moving, driven by a panic that overrode rational thought. She had brought danger to this place, had repaid Brandon's generosity by making him a target. The least she could do was lead the trouble away from his door. She made it 3 steps toward the back of the cabin before Brandon caught her arm, his grip firm but not painful. "I said stay put." "You don't understand," Sarah said, trying to pull free. "They're probably looking for me. I can't let them find me here. I won't let you get hurt because of me. And I won't let you run off into the woods to face whatever's coming alone." The conviction in his voice stopped her struggles, made her look up into his face. What she saw there was not fear or anger, but a kind of grim determination that spoke of a man who had faced trouble before and survived it. "You don't know what you're getting into," she said. "Then tell me." But there wasn't time. The hoofbeats were closer now, and Sarah could hear voices, rough male voices calling to each other as they approached the cabin. Her worst fears were being realized, and she felt the familiar taste of panic rising in her throat. "Sarah Anderson!" The voice that shouted her name was loud enough to carry through the cabin walls, rough with authority and something that might have been satisfaction. "We know you're in there. Come out now, and maybe we can settle this without anyone getting hurt." Sarah closed her eyes, her body sagging with defeat. She recognized the voice, had heard it before in the valley below, when she had been trying to find work, trying to find some way to survive that didn't involve charity or worse. Daniel Hughes, the sheriff's deputy, a man with a reputation for being thorough in his pursuit of lawbreakers and flexible in his interpretation of justice. "What did you do?" Brandon asked quietly. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him, this stranger who had shown her more kindness in an hour than she had received from anyone in months. She owed him the truth, even if it meant destroying whatever fragile trust had been building between them. "I stole more than just bread," she admitted. "There was money from the general store in Pine Creek. I didn't mean to take it, but it was there, and I was so desperate, and I thought—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to explain the moment of weakness that had led her to take the coins from the till while the shopkeeper was in the back room. It had been such a small amount, barely enough to buy a few days' worth of food, But theft was theft, regardless of the circumstances. Brandon nodded slowly as if this explained everything he needed to know about the situation. How much? $3.40. That's all? The question surprised her. She had expected condemnation, disgust, the kind of moral outrage that decent people were supposed to feel when confronted with criminal behavior. Instead, Brandon seemed almost amused, as if the amount was so small as to be insignificant. It's still stealing, she said. Yes, it is. And they are still going to want to make an example of you. The matter-of-fact way he said it made Sarah's stomach clench with dread. She knew what happened to thieves in these parts, especially female thieves who had no family to protect them or money to pay for proper legal representation. At best, she would spend months in jail. At worst, Sarah Anderson, the voice came again, closer now, right outside the cabin. This is your last chance. Come out with your hands where we can see them. Brandon moved to the window again, his movements careful and controlled. 3 men, he reported quietly. Armed. They look like they mean business. Sarah felt the walls of the cabin closing in around her, felt the weight of her choices pressing down like a physical thing. She had been so careful, so cautious in her desperation, but it hadn't been enough. Someone had seen her, had identified her, had sent the law after her with the kind of determination usually reserved for more serious criminals. I have to go out there, she said. No, you don't. The certainty in Brandon's voice made her look at him sharply. He was still watching the window, but there was something different about his posture now. Something that spoke of a man preparing for action. You can't fight them, Sarah said. There are 3 of them, and they're armed, and they represent the law. Even if you win, you'll be a wanted man. Maybe, or maybe they'll decide this isn't worth the trouble. Before Sarah could ask what he meant by that, Brandon was moving toward a cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened it and withdrew a rifle, checking the action with the practiced ease of someone who knew weapons intimately. Don't do this, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, I'm not worth it. Brandon paused in his preparations, turning to look at her with those storm gray eyes. That's not for you to decide. Brandon Wright, a new voice joined the chorus outside. This one younger but no less determined. We know you're in there too. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Ethan Lopez, Brandon muttered, and Sarah heard something like resignation in his voice. Should have known he'd be involved. You know him? We have history. The way he said it suggested that history was not pleasant, and Sarah felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her. She had not only brought the law to his door, she had brought someone with a personal grudge. Someone who might be looking for an excuse to settle old scores. This is my fault, she said. Let me go out there. Let me face whatever's coming. And then what? You think they're going to be satisfied with just arresting you? You think they're going to treat you fairly? Give you a proper trial? Make sure you get justice instead of just punishment? The questions hit her like physical blows because she knew the answers, had known them from the moment she heard Daniel Hughes call her name. Men like him didn't climb mountains to arrest women for petty theft because they believed in justice. They did it because they enjoyed the hunt, because they got satisfaction from bringing down someone weaker than themselves. What choice do I have? She asked. Brandon was quiet for a moment, still holding the rifle, still watching the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but filled with a kind of fierce determination that made her chest tight. You have the choice to let someone stand with you. You have the choice to accept help when it's offered freely. You have the choice to believe that maybe, just maybe, you are worth fighting for. The words hit her harder than any physical blow could have, cutting through the layers of self-doubt and despair that had been building around her heart like scar tissue. When was the last time someone had suggested she was worth fighting for? When was the last time anyone had been willing to take a risk on her behalf? Sarah Anderson. The voice outside was growing impatient now, edged with the kind of anger that it suggested time was running out. We're giving you 1 more minute, then we're coming in. Sarah looked at Brandon, at this man who barely knew her but was apparently willing to put himself in danger for her sake. She thought about her father's final words, about surviving no matter what it took, about being stronger than the circumstances that threatened to crush her. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Brandon smiled then, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and somehow more dangerous at the same time. "I want you to trust me," he said. "Can you do that?" Sarah looked at the rifle in his hands, at the determination in his eyes, at the man who was offering her something she had almost forgotten existed, hope. "Yes," she said. The word had barely left her lips when the cabin door exploded inward, splintering off its hinges as three armed men burst through the opening. Sarah caught a glimpse of Daniel Hughes in the lead, his face flushed with excitement and something that looked like anticipation, before Brandon shoved her behind the heavy wooden table and brought his rifle to bear. "That's far enough," Brandon said, his voice calm and steady despite the chaos erupting around them. The three men froze, their own weapons half raised, suddenly finding themselves in a standoff they hadn't expected. Sarah crouched behind the table, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it, and waited to see whether the next few seconds would bring salvation or disaster. "Brandon Wright," Daniel Hughes said, and there was something like satisfaction in his voice. "Should have known we'd find you mixed up in this. Should have known you'd kick down a man's door without so much as a by your leave," Brandon replied. "Some things never change, do they, Hughes?" The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Sarah could feel the weight of old grievances and unfinished business pressing down on all of them. Whatever history existed between Brandon and these men, it was clear that her presence here was just the excuse they had been looking for to settle old scores. "We're here for the girl," Ethan Lopez said, and Sarah could see him from her position behind the table, younger than the others, but with hard eyes that spoke of violence barely held in check. "Hand her over, and maybe we can forget about the rest of this." "What rest of this?" Brandon asked. "Man can't have visitors in his own home anymore?" "Visitors don't usually come with a price on their heads," Daniel Hughes said. $3.40 might not seem like much to you, right? But theft is theft, and harboring a criminal is a crime too." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her again, felt the familiar weight of despair settling over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She had been foolish to think she could escape the consequences of her actions, foolish to believe that kindness from a stranger could somehow change the fundamental realities of her situation. But then Brandon spoke again, his voice still calm, still steady, still filled with that quiet determination that had given her hope just moments before. "Funny thing about that," he said. "I was just thinking the same thing." The confusion in the room was palpable, and Sarah found herself holding her breath as she waited to see what Brandon meant. He had positioned himself between her and the three armed men, his rifle trained on Daniel Hughes, but there was something in his posture that suggested he had more than just firepower on his side. "What are you talking about, Wright?" Hughes demanded. "I'm talking about the fact that Sarah Anderson never stole anything from anybody." The words hung in the air like a physical thing, and Sarah felt her world tilt on its axis. What was Brandon doing? She had confessed to the theft, had admitted her guilt freely. Why was he lying for her? "That's not what the shopkeeper says," Ethan Lopez said. "Marcus Whitmore saw her clear as day, taking money from his till." "Marcus Whitmore is a drunk and a larum," Brandon said. "Always has been, but more importantly, he's a man who owes me money. Quite a bit of money, as it happens." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand what Brandon was suggesting. Was he claiming that Marcus Whitmore had fabricated the theft accusation to avoid paying a debt? It seemed far-fetched, but there was something in Brandon's tone that suggested he wasn't bluffing. "You're saying Whitmore made this up?" Daniel Hughes asked, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, as if he was beginning to wonder if he had been played. "I'm saying Marcus Whitmore would say just about anything to get out from under the $300 he owes me for lumber and supplies," Brandon said, "including pointing the finger at an innocent woman who happened to be in his store at the wrong time." $300. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the implications of what Brandon was saying. If he was telling the truth, if Marcus Whitmore really did owe him that much money, then the shopkeeper would indeed have strong motivation to create a distraction from his own financial troubles. But was Brandon telling the truth? Or was he simply spinning an elaborate lie to protect her from the consequences of her actions? Prove it, Ethan Lopez said, and there was challenge in his voice, as if he was eager for this confrontation to escalate beyond words. I intend to, Brandon said. Soon as we all ride down to Pine Creek together and have a little conversation with Marcus Whitmore, in front of witnesses, with his account books spread out on the table for everyone to see. The silence that followed was deafening, and Sarah could practically hear the wheels turning in the heads of the three lawmen as they considered this unexpected development. If Brandon was bluffing, it was a dangerous bluff, one that would be exposed the moment they reached town. But if he was telling the truth, "You're saying you can prove Whitmore owes you money?" Daniel Hughes asked. "I'm saying I have receipts, signed IOUs, and witnesses to half a dozen transactions over the past 6 months. I'm also saying that Marcus Whitmore has been avoiding me for weeks, ducking out the back of his store every time I come to town, refusing to answer my letters about payment." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope beginning to grow in her chest. Fragile and tentative, but real nonetheless. Could it be possible that her theft had been discovered not because someone had seen her take the money, but because Marcus Whitmore had noticed the missing funds and decided to blame her rather than admit he couldn't account for his own cash? Even if that's true, the third man said, speaking for the first time, it doesn't prove she didn't take the money. Sarah recognized him now as John Sanchez, the sheriff's other deputy, a man with a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession. He was the kind of lawman who dotted every I and crossed every T, who wouldn't be satisfied with easy answers or convenient explanations. No, Brandon agreed, but it does raise reasonable doubt about his accusation. And it gives us all a good reason to ask some hard questions about what really happened to that money. "You're willing to ride down to Pine Creek with us?" Daniel Hughes asked. "Right now?" "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to see justice done," Brandon said. "The question is, are you?" The challenge was unmistakable, and Sarah could see the three lawmen exchanging glances, silently communicating in the way that men who worked together often did. They had come up the mountain expecting to make an easy arrest to bring back a desperate woman who had stolen a few dollars out of hunger and desperation. Instead, they found themselves facing a much more complex situation, one that involved accusations and counter-accusations, debts and deceptions, and a man with a rifle who seemed perfectly willing to back up his words with action. "All right," Daniel Hughes said finally, "we'll all ride down together, but if this turns out to be some kind of trick, right, if you're running to protect this woman, I'll see you both in chains." "Fair enough," Brandon said. "But if I'm telling the truth, if Marcus Whitmore has been playing you for fools, then I expect apologies all around. And I expect Sarah Anderson to be left alone to get on with her life." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she listened to this exchange. This negotiation for her freedom being conducted by a man who barely knew her, but was apparently willing to risk everything on her behalf. She still didn't understand why he was doing this, why he was willing to put himself in danger for someone who had stolen bread from his porch just hours earlier. But she was beginning to understand that Brandon Wright was not the kind of man who did things for simple reasons, or who could be easily categorized according to the usual social conventions. He was something rarer and more dangerous, a man who acted according to his own moral code, regardless of what others might think or expect. "Get up," Daniel Hughes said, gesturing towards Sarah with his rifle. "You're coming with us." Sarah started to rise from her position behind the table, but Brandon's voice stopped her. "She rides with me," he said, "on my horse. If we're all going to town together, we're going as equals, not as prisoners and captors." "She's under arrest," Ethan Lopez protested. "She's under suspicion," Brandon corrected. "There's a difference. At least there should be in a civilized society." The barb hit home, and Sarah could see the flush of anger that spread across Ethan Lopez's face. But Daniel Hughes held up a hand, forestalling whatever response his younger colleague might have made. "Fine," Hughes said. "She rides with you, but if either of you tries to run, if you so much as look sideways at us wrong, we'll shoot first and ask questions later." "Understood," Brandon said. He lowered his rifle slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. But Sarah noticed that he didn't set the weapon aside entirely. Instead, he kept it ready, positioned so that he could bring it to bear quickly if the situation deteriorated. "Sarah," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the three lawmen. "We're going to walk outside now, nice and slow. Stay close to me and don't do anything sudden." Sarah nodded, her mouth too dry for speech. She could hardly believe what was happening, could barely process the fact that she was about to ride down the mountain, not as a prisoner, but as someone whose innocence was at least being questioned rather than simply assumed away. They moved toward the door in a careful procession, Brandon leading the way with Sarah close behind him, the three lawmen following with their weapons still drawn but no longer pointed directly at them. The afternoon sun seemed blindingly bright after the dim interior of the cabin, and Sarah had to squint as her eyes adjusted to the light. 5 horses stood tied to the porch railing, their breath visible in the cool mountain air. Brandon's mare, a sturdy bay with intelligent eyes, nickered softly as he approached, and Sarah found herself wondering how long it had been since she had ridden a horse. How long since she had done anything that wasn't directly related to the basic business of survival. "Up you go," Brandon said, offering her his hand to help her mount. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, looking into his storm-gray eyes, searching for some sign of what he was really thinking, some clue as to whether his confidence was real or simply an act designed to get them both out of immediate danger. What she saw there was resolve, determination, and something else that took her breath away. Faith. Not religious faith, but something more personal and immediate. Faith in her, faith in the possibility that truth would win out over convenience, faith in the idea that sometimes taking a stand was worth the risk. She took his hand and let him help her onto the horse, settling behind him on the broad back of the mare. The warmth of his body was comforting, and she found herself leaning into him slightly, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Ready?" Daniel Hughes asked, and there was impatience in his voice, as if he was eager to get this confrontation over with one way or another. "Ready," Brandon said. But as they prepared to ride down the mountain toward Pine Creek and whatever awaited them there, Sarah caught sight of movement in the trees beyond the cabin. A flash of color that didn't belong, a shape that suggested someone else was watching this scene unfold. Her blood turned to ice as she realized what this might mean. If Marcus Whitmore had sent the law after her, if he was desperate enough to fabricate charges to cover his own financial troubles, then he might be desperate enough to take more direct action to ensure his story wasn't challenged. "Brandon," she whispered, her lips close to his ear. "There's someone in the trees." She felt his body tense, felt him shift slightly in the saddle as he tried to locate the threat without making it obvious that he had been alerted to its presence. "Where?" he murmured back. "Northeast, about 50 yards, behind the big pine with the broken top." Brandon nodded almost imperceptibly, and Sarah realized he had spotted whatever she had seen. But before either of them could react further, the crack of a rifle shot split the mountain air, and everything dissolved into chaos. The rifle shot echoed across the mountainside like thunder, and Sarah felt Brandon's body jerk beneath her as the bullet found its mark. Blood bloomed across his shoulder, dark against the fabric of his shirt, and he swayed in the saddle before catching himself against the mare's neck. "Ambush!" Daniel Hughes shouted, his voice cutting through the sudden chaos as the 3 lawmen scattered, their horses dancing and snorting in fear. Sarah wrapped her arms around Brandon's waist, feeling the warmth of his blood seeping through her fingers as she tried to keep him upright. The mare beneath them was fighting the bit, her eyes rolling white with terror, and Sarah could hear more shots cracking through the air around them. "The cabin!" Brandon gasped, his voice tight with pain. "Get to the cabin!" But even as he spoke, Sarah could see figures emerging from the tree line, at least 4 men with rifles, moving with the coordinated precision of a planned assault. They had been waiting to, she realized with growing horror. This entire confrontation had been orchestrated, designed to draw them out into the open where they would be vulnerable. "It's a trap," she whispered, her lips close to his ear. Brandon nodded grimly, his face pale but his jaw set with determination. "Marcus Whitmore's insurance policy. Can't let us get to town to tell our side of the story." Another shot rang out, this one close enough that Sarah felt the wind of the bullet as it passed her cheek. The mare reared, nearly unseating them both, and Sarah had to grab the saddle horn with one hand while keeping her other arm wrapped around Brandon's waist. Ethan Lopez was returning fire now, his rifle barking in rapid succession as he tried to pin down the attackers in the tree line. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, caught in the open with nowhere to run and precious little cover. "This way," John Sanchez shouted, spurring his horse toward a cluster of boulders 50 yards to their left. "We can make a stand there." But Brandon was already turning the mare in the opposite direction, toward a steep trail that led up the mountainside away from the cabin. Sarah could feel his body trembling with pain and shock, could see the way his hands shook as he gripped the reins, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Not with them," he said. "They'll use us as shields, then leave us behind when things get bad." Sarah looked back over her shoulder and saw Daniel Hughes doing exactly what Brandon had predicted, positioning himself behind Ethan Ice Lopez as they made their retreat toward the rocks. These men had come to arrest her, but now that real danger had presented itself, their priorities had shifted to their own survival. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Higher ground. There's a place I know, defensible position. We can hold them off until dark, then slip away." The trail was narrow and treacherous, barely wide enough for a horse, with loose shale that shifted and slid under the mare's hooves. Sarah could hear their pursuers crashing through the underbrush below, could hear voices shouting orders and coordinates as they tried to track their quarry up the mountainside. Brandon was slumping forward now, his strength ebbing with each drop of blood that soaked into his shirt. Sarah pressed her hand against the wound, trying to stem the flow, but she could feel the warm stickiness spreading between her fingers. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Don't you dare leave me alone up here." "Not planning on it," Brandon replied, but his voice was weaker now, threaded with pain that he was fighting to control. The trail leveled out onto a narrow ledge, barely 20 feet wide, with sheer rock walls rising on one side and a precipitous drop on the other. It was a natural fortress, Sarah realized, a place where a few defenders could hold off a much larger force. But it was also a trap, with only one way in or out. Brandon guided the mare to the back of the ledge, where an overhang provided some shelter from the elements and concealment from below. He dismounted with obvious difficulty, his face gray with pain, and Sarah slid down after him. "Help me with the rifle," he said, gesturing toward the weapon still strapped to his saddle. Sarah retrieved the rifle and a box of ammunition, her hands shaking as she tried to process what was happening. Just hours ago, she had been stealing bread to survive another day. Now she was trapped on a mountain ledge with a wounded man, surrounded by killers who wanted to silence them both. "Wait, she asked as she helped Brandon position himself behind a low wall of stone that provided cover while still allowing him to see the trail below. "Why is Marcus Whitmore willing to kill to cover up a debt?" Brandon checked the action of his rifle, his movements automatic despite his injury. $300 is a lot of money to a man like Whitmore, but it's not just the money, it's what happens when people start asking questions about his books, about where all that cash has been going. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Marcus Whitmore has been skimming from his own store for months, maybe years, taking money that should have gone to his suppliers, his creditors, his own family. When you walked into his store that day, when a few dollars went missing from his till, he saw an opportunity to blame someone else for losses that were much bigger than anyone realized." Sarah felt sick as the implications sank in. She had been set up, used as a scapegoat for crimes she hadn't committed. And now Marcus Whitmore was willing to commit murder to keep his secrets buried. "The lawmen," she said, "do they know?" Brandon shook his head. "Hughes and Lopez are honest enough, in their way. They think they're chasing a thief and the man who's harboring her. They don't know they're being used to clean up someone else's mess." A shout from below interrupted their conversation, and Sarah saw men moving up the trail, spread out in a loose line, their rifles ready. She counted 5 of them, more than she had initially seen, and realized that Marcus Whitmore had hired professional gunmen for this job. "Can you shoot?" Brandon asked. Sarah thought of her father, of the lessons he had given her when she was barely old enough to hold a rifle steady. "Yes." "Good, because we're going to need every advantage we can get." Brandon positioned himself at the left side of their makeshift fortification while Sarah took the right. The approaching gunmen were still 100 yards away, picking their way carefully up the treacherous trail, but they would be in range soon enough. Sarah Anderson! The voice that called her name was unfamiliar, rough with the kind of authority that came from violence rather than law. You've caused enough trouble. Come down peaceable and maybe we can work something out. Don't answer, Brandon said quietly. Let them think we might be willing to negotiate. Buy us some time. But Sarah was thinking about the three lawmen who had been left behind in the valley below, about Daniel Hughes and Ethan Lopez and John Sanchez, who might already be dead because of her presence at Brandon's cabin. She had brought this disaster down on all of them, had turned a simple arrest into a bloodbath. This is my fault, she said. No, Brandon replied, his voice firm despite his obvious pain. This is Marcus Whitmore's fault, and the fault of the men he hired to clean up his mess. You're just the convenient excuse they're using to justify murder. The first gunman had reached the base of the final approach to their ledge, a steep section of trail that would force the attackers to come at them one or two at a time. Sarah could see his face now, weathered and hard, the kind of man who killed for money and slept well afterward. Christopher Scott, Brandon muttered, recognizing the man. Should have known Whitmore would hire the best. You know him? By reputation, he's a professional, the kind of man who doesn't take a job unless he's sure he can finish it, which means he has a plan we haven't figured out yet. As if to confirm Brandon's words, Christopher Scott raised his hand and made a series of gestures to his companions. Two of the men immediately broke off from the main group, disappearing into the rocks to the left of the trail. Flanking maneuver, Brandon said. They're going to try to get above us. Come down from the ridge. Sarah looked up at the towering rock wall that rose behind their position, searching for any sign of movement. The stone was weathered and broken, full of cracks and ledges that a skilled climber could use to reach their level. If the gunmen managed to get above them, their defensive position would become a death trap. How long before they can get up there? She asked. 20 minutes, maybe less if they know what they're doing. Then we need to be gone before then. Brandon shook his head. Where? There's nowhere to run from here, except back down the trail, and that's exactly where they want us to go. Sarah studied their surroundings more carefully, looking for options that might not be immediately obvious. The ledge was narrow, but it extended further to the right than she had initially realized, curving around the mountainside until it disappeared behind an outcropping of rock. What's around that bend? She asked. Brandon followed her gaze, then winced as the movement aggravated his wound. Another trail, eventually, leads to the old mining camp about 2 miles east, but it's treacherous, especially in this light. More treacherous than staying here to be shot? Brandon considered this, his storm-gray eyes calculating odds and possibilities. The trail's been washed out in places. One wrong step and you fall 500 feet to the rocks below. But it's a way out. Maybe, if we can reach it before they get organized down there. Christopher Scott was gesturing again, and Sarah could see more men emerging from the tree line below. At least 8 now, possibly more. All armed and moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. We have to try, Sarah said. Staying here means dying here. Brandon nodded slowly, then began the painful process of gathering their supplies. His rifle, the ammunition, a canteen of water from his saddle, and a small pack that contained basic survival gear. Every movement sent fresh blood seeping through his shirt, and Sarah could see the strain etched in the lines around his eyes. Can you make it? She asked. I'll make it, he replied, but she could hear the uncertainty beneath his determination. They began moving along the ledge, keeping low to avoid being spotted from below. The rock was slippery with moisture from the mountain mist, and Sarah found herself testing each step carefully before committing her full weight. Behind them, she could hear Christopher Scott shouting orders to his men, coordinating the assault on their abandoned position. It wouldn't take long for them to realize their quarry had escaped, and then the real chase would begin. The ledge narrowed as they progressed, becoming little more than a crack in the rock face. Sarah pressed herself against the stone wall, her heart hammering as she inched forward, trying not to look down at the dizzying drop to her left. Brandon was struggling now, his breathing labored, his face pale with blood loss. Twice he stumbled, and twice Sarah caught him, her own strength surprising her as adrenaline and desperation gave her capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. Almost there, he gasped, pointing toward the outcropping that marked the beginning of the Eastern Trail. But as they rounded the bend, Sarah's heart sank. The trail that Brandon had described was barely visible, little more than a series of handholds and footholds carved into the rock face generations ago by miners seeking their fortune in these mountains. It was a path for mountain goats, not for humans, especially not for a wounded man and a woman in a dress. "We can't," she said. "We have to," Brandon replied. "They'll be here in minutes." As if to emphasize his point, they heard the crack of rifle fire from behind them, followed by angry shouts as the gunmen discovered their empty fortification. Christopher Scott's voice rose above the others, barking orders with the authority of a man accustomed to command. "They're moving," he called. "Spread out! Find them!" Sarah looked at the treacherous path ahead, then back at Brandon's pale face. He was losing too much blood, growing weaker by the minute. Even if they managed to navigate the dangerous trail, how long could he last before shock and blood loss claimed him? "There's another way," she said suddenly. "What?" "You stay here. I'll go back, surrender to them. Tell them I forced you to help me, that you're innocent in all this." Brandon's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. "Absolutely not. It makes sense. Without me, they have no reason to hurt you. Marcus Whitmore's quarrel is with me, not with you. You think Christopher Scott and his men are going to just walk away because you surrender? You think they're going to leave a witness alive who can testify about what really happened here?" The logic was inescapable, but Sarah couldn't accept it. She couldn't let Brandon die because of her problems, couldn't allow his kindness to become the instrument of his destruction. "Then what do you suggest?" she asked. Brandon was quiet for a moment, studying the path ahead with the eye of a man who had spent his life in these mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady despite his obvious pain. "We go together, or we don't go at all." "Brandon, no arguments. We're partners now, whether we planned it that way or not. Partners don't abandon each other when things get difficult." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of their escape. When was the last time someone had called her a partner? When was the last time anyone had been willing to link their fate to hers, to stand with her against impossible odds? "All right," she said. "Partners." Brandon smiled, the expression transforming his face despite the pain and exhaustion etched there. "Partners." They began the descent, Brandon leading the way despite his injury, testing each handhold before trusting it with his weight. Sarah followed close behind, her dress hampering her movement, but her determination carrying her forward. The path was even worse than it had appeared from a distance. Ancient and poorly maintained, carved by men who had been more concerned with speed than safety, it wound down the mountainside in a series of switchbacks that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. Twice, Sarah's foot slipped on loose stone, sending a cascade of pebbles tumbling into the void below. Each time, Brandon caught her, his strong hand closing around her wrist, pulling her back to safety, even as the effort cost him precious strength. "Easy," he murmured. "Take your time. Better to go slow and arrive alive than to hurry and not arrive at all." But even as he spoke, they could hear their pursuers above them, Christopher Scott's men spreading out along the ledge, searching for their trail. It would only be a matter of time before someone spotted the ancient mining path and realized where they had gone. "There!" The shout came from above, followed immediately by the crack of rifle fire. Bullets sparked off the rock around them, sending chips of stone flying in all directions. "Move!" Brandon shouted, abandoning caution for speed. They half ran, half fell down the treacherous path, using their hands as much as their feet, sliding and scrambling over loose rock and weathered stone. Sarah's dress tore on the rough surface, her hands and knees scraped raw, but she didn't slow down. Behind them, she could hear Christopher Scott organizing a pursuit, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Two of you stay here, keep them pinned down. The rest of you find another way down. We're not letting them escape." The path curved around a massive boulder, temporarily shielding them from the gunfire above. Brandon collapsed against the stone, his chest heaving, his shirt now soaked with blood from shoulder to waist. "How much further?" Sarah asked. Half a mile, maybe less, but it gets worse before it gets better. Sarah looked ahead and saw what he meant. The path disappeared entirely for a stretch of 20 feet, replaced by a series of iron spikes driven into the rock face, rusty with age and corrosion. It was a ladder of sorts, designed to allow miners to traverse a section of cliff that was too sheer for a conventional trail. "Those spikes are 50 years old," Brandon said. "Maybe older. No way to know if they'll hold our weight." "No choice," Sarah replied, echoing his earlier words. She went first this time, testing each spike carefully before trusting it with her full weight. The iron was rough under her hands, flakes of rust coming away at her touch, but the spikes held. Behind her, she could hear Brandon following, his breathing harsh and labored. Halfway across, one of the spikes pulled loose under her weight, and Sarah found herself dangling by one hand over the abyss. For a terrifying moment, she thought she was going to fall, thought this was how her story would end, with a long scream and a sudden impact on the rocks below. But Brandon's hand closed around her wrist, his grip strong despite his injury, and he hauled her back against the rock face. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I've got you." They completed the traverse and found themselves on a wider section of trail carved into a natural shelf in the mountainside. Here, finally, they could move more quickly, though the path was still treacherous and the drop to their left remained dizzying. "The mining camp's just ahead," Brandon said, pointing toward a cluster of weathered buildings visible in the distance. "We can rest there, figure out our next move." But even as he spoke, Sarah could see movement on the trail behind them. Christopher Scott had found another way down, and he was coming fast, his men strung out behind him like a pack of hunting wolves. The abandoned mining camp consisted of half a dozen buildings in various states of decay, their wooden walls weathered gray by decades of mountain winters. Sarah and Brandon stumbled into the largest structure, which had once been a bunkhouse for the miners, and collapsed onto the dusty floor. Brandon's breathing was shallow now, his face ashen with blood loss. Sarah tore strips from her already damaged dress and tried to fashion a proper bandage for his wound, but she could see that he needed medical attention far beyond what she could provide. "We can't stay here," she said. "They'll find us in minutes." Brandon nodded weakly. "There's a mine shaft behind the camp. Leads down into the mountain. We could hide there. Or we could be trapped there. Better than being sitting ducks out here." Sarah helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight as they made their way toward the back of the camp. The mine entrance was a dark opening in the mountainside, reinforced with rotting timber that looked ready to collapse at any moment. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "I'm not sure about anything anymore," Brandon admitted, "but it's the only chance we've got." They entered the mine, the darkness swallowing them like a living thing. Sarah had to feel her way forward, one hand on the rough stone wall, the other supporting Brandon as he stumbled beside her. The air was cold and stale, heavy with the smell of dampness and decay. Behind them, they could hear Christopher Scott and his men reaching the mining camp, their voices echoing off the weathered buildings as they searched for their quarry. "Check every building," Scott commanded. "They can't have gone far." Sarah and Brandon pressed deeper into the mine, following a tunnel that seemed to stretch endlessly into the mountain's heart. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, and Sarah found herself jumping at every sound, every whisper of movement in the darkness. "How deep does this go?" she whispered. "Deep enough," Brandon replied, but his voice was getting weaker, and she could feel him leaning more heavily against her with each step. The tunnel branched ahead, splitting into 3 separate passages. Brandon paused, trying to orient himself in the darkness, then chose the middle path. But after only a few yards, they encountered a pile of fallen rock that blocked their way completely. "Cave in," Brandon said unnecessarily. They backtracked and tried the left passage, but it, too, was blocked after a short distance. The right passage remained, disappearing into darkness that seemed even deeper and more forbidding than what they had already traversed. "This is it," Brandon said, "our last option." They entered the right passage, and immediately Sarah knew something was different. The air moved here, carrying a scent that was fresher, less stale than the rest of the mine. There was another way out, she realized, another entrance somewhere ahead. But their relief was short-lived. Behind them, they heard voices in the main tunnel, and the flickering light of torches began to penetrate the darkness. "They're in the mine!" Christopher Scott's voice echoed off the stone walls. "Spread out! Check every passage!" Sarah and Brandon pressed forward as quickly as they dared. But Brandon was stumbling now, his strength nearly exhausted. She could feel his blood soaking through the makeshift bandage, could hear the harsh rasp of his breathing in the confined space. "Leave me," he whispered. "Go on ahead. Find the other entrance." "No," Sarah said firmly. "We're partners, remember? Partners don't abandon each other." But even as she spoke, she could hear their pursuers getting closer, their voices and torchlight growing stronger with each passing moment. Soon they would reach the junction, would discover which passage their quarry had taken, and then it would only be a matter of time. The tunnel curved ahead, and suddenly Sarah could see light, real light, not the artificial glow of torches, but the natural illumination of daylight. The other entrance was there, just ahead, salvation within reach. But as they stumbled toward the light, Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of voices outside the mine, men positioned to catch them as they emerged. "It's another trap," she whispered. Brandon nodded grimly. "Whitmore's men. They know these mountains as well as I do. They've got us boxed in." Sarah looked back the way they had come, where torchlight was beginning to flicker around the curve of the tunnel, then forward toward the entrance where their enemies waited. They were caught between two forces, with nowhere to run and no way to fight. "What do we do?" she asked. Brandon was quiet for a moment, his breathing labored, his face pale in the dim light filtering in from outside. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady despite his obvious weakness. "We make a stand," he said. "Right here, right now, we don't run anymore." Sarah looked at him. This man who had shown her kindness when she needed it most, who had risked everything to protect her from forces she barely understood. He was dying, she realized. The blood loss was too much, his strength nearly gone. But still he was willing to fight, still determined to stand with her against impossible odds. "All right," she said, "we make a stand." Brandon positioned himself against one wall of the tunnel, his rifle ready despite the tremor in his hands. Sarah took the opposite wall, the pistol he had given her feeling heavy and unfamiliar in her grip. "Sarah," he said quietly. "Yes? Whatever happens, I want you to know. Meeting you, helping you, it's been an honor." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. There would be time for grief later, if there was a later. Right now, she had to be strong, had to be worthy of the faith this man had shown in her. "The honor's been mine," she replied. The torchlight was closer now, and they could hear Christopher Scott's voice directing his men, coordinating their final assault. From outside came the sound of boots on stone, men taking positions around the mine entrance. "This is it," Brandon whispered. Sarah nodded, her finger tightening on the trigger of her pistol. She thought of her father, of his final words about survival and strength. She thought of all the choices that had led her to this moment, all the desperate decisions and small compromises that had brought her to a standoff in an abandoned mine with a wounded stranger who had become the most important person in her world. The first torch appeared around the curve of the tunnel, followed by the shadowy figure of a gunman moving cautiously forward. Sarah held her breath, waiting for Brandon's signal, waiting for the moment when words would give way to violence and everything would be decided by speed and accuracy and luck. "Now, Brandon whispered. The tunnel exploded into chaos as both sides opened fire simultaneously, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like lightning, the sound of gunshots echoing and re-echoing off the stone walls until it became a continuous roar of violence. Yasan. Sarah fired twice, 3 times, her shots guided more by instinct than aim in the confusion and darkness. She heard a cry of pain, saw one of the torches fall and go out. But there were more men coming, more weapons firing, more bullets ricocheting off the stone around them. Brandon's rifle barked beside hers, steady and methodical despite his injuries. She could see him in the muzzle flashes, his face set with grim determination, his movements precise and controlled even as his strength ebbed away. But there were too many of them, too many guns, too many angles of attack. Sarah felt a bullet tug at her sleeve, felt chips of stone sting her cheek as another shot sparked off the wall beside her head. "Sarah!" Brandon's voice was urgent. Warning. Ruhumum. She turned and saw Christopher Scott himself emerging from the darkness, his rifle trained on her heart, his finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she was about to die. But Brandon was moving, throwing himself between her and the gunman's weapon, his body absorbing the bullet that had been meant for her. He collapsed against her, his weight carrying them both to the ground, his blood warm against her hands. "Brandon," she screamed, but even as his name left her lips, she could see more men emerging from the darkness, could see Christopher Scott working the action of his rifle, preparing to finish what he had started. This was how it ended, she realized. Not with triumph or escape, but with death in the darkness, far from anyone who might mourn their passing. She closed her eyes and waited for the final shot, the bullet that would reunite her with her father and end the long struggle that her life had become. But the shot, when it came, was not aimed at her. The rifle crack echoed through the tunnel, but it was Christopher Scott who staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, his weapon clattering to the stone floor. Behind him, Sarah could see another figure emerging from the darkness, and her heart leaped as she recognized the uniform of a sheriff's deputy. "Drop your weapons," Daniel Hughes commanded, his rifle trained on the remaining gunmen. "All of you now." The men who had been advancing on Sarah and Brandon's position hesitated, caught off guard by this unexpected development. In that moment of confusion, Sarah heard more voices from the mine entrance, more lawmen taking positions outside. "It's over, Scott," Hughes called. "You're surrounded. Tell your men to stand down." Christopher Scott clutched his wounded shoulder, his face twisted with pain and rage. "You don't understand," he snarled. "That woman is a thief. We're here on behalf of Marcus Whitmore, acting within the law." "Funny thing about that," came another voice. And Sarah saw Ethan Lopez emerging from the tunnel behind Hughes. "We just had a very interesting conversation with Marcus Whitmore. Seems his story's changed quite a bit since this morning." Sarah looked down at Brandon, who was still conscious but barely, his breathing shallow and his face pale as parchment. Blood was spreading across his shirt from the new wound, adding to the damage from the earlier shot. "Stay with me," she whispered, pressing her hands against the wounds, trying to stem the flow. "Help is here. You're going to be all right." Brandon's eyes focused on her with obvious effort. "Sarah," he whispered, "the truth. Did it come out?" Before she could answer, Daniel Hughes was kneeling beside them, his medical training from his Army days taking over as he assessed Brandon's injuries. "He needs a doctor," Hughes said grimly. "Soon, or he's not going to make it." "What about Whitmore?" Sarah asked. "What did he tell you?" Ethan Lopez moved closer, keeping his rifle trained on Christopher Scott and his men. "Whitmore broke down the minute we started asking hard questions about his books. Turns out Wright was right about the debt and about a lot more besides. Whitmore's been embezzling from his own store for years, skimming money from the till and blaming it on inventory losses. When you walked into his store that day," Hughes continued, "when a few dollars went missing from his cash drawer, he saw an opportunity to pin all his losses on you, make you the scapegoat for crimes that went back months, maybe years." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anger wash over her. Relief that the truth was finally coming out. Anger that so much suffering could have been avoided if Marcus Whitmore had simply been honest about his financial troubles. "So I'm not under arrest?" she asked. "You're not under arrest," Hughes confirmed. "In fact, you're the victim here. Whitmore's the one who'll be facing charges, along with the Scott and his men, for attempted murder." Christopher Scott spat blood onto the stone floor of the tunnel. "You can't prove anything. It's our word against theirs." "Actually," out came a new voice from the mine entrance, "we can prove quite a bit." Sarah looked up to see John Sanchez entering the tunnel, carrying a leather satchel that she didn't recognize. Behind him came two more men she had never seen before, both wearing the badges of federal marshals. "Gentlemen," Sanchez said, addressing Christopher Scott and his companions, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and violation of federal statutes regarding interstate commerce. Seems Marcus Whitmore's been doing business with some very unsavory characters, using his store as a front for money laundering and worse." Sarah's head was spinning as she tried to process this new information. The simple matter of a few stolen dollars had uncovered a conspiracy that reached far beyond the boundaries of their small mountain community. "How did you know?" she asked. "We've been watching Whitmore for months," one of the federal marshals explained, waiting for him to make a mistake that would give us the evidence we needed. When he hired Scott and his men to eliminate witnesses to his crimes, he gave us everything we needed to bring him down. Sarah looked down at Brandon, who was listening to this exchange with obvious effort, his breathing still labored but his eyes alert. "Did you know," she asked him, "about the federal investigation?" Brandon shook his head weakly. Suspected something wasn't right. Whitmore's been too nervous lately, too eager to avoid conversations about money, but I thought it was just the debt. Daniel Hughes was working on Brandon's wounds now, using supplies from his saddlebags to fashion proper bandages. "We need to get him down the mountain," he said. "There's a doctor in Pine Creek who can help him, but we need to move fast." "What about them?" Sarah asked, indicating Christopher Scott and his men. "They'll be coming with us," one of the federal marshals said. "All of them. This case is going to trial, and we're going to need witnesses." As the lawmen began securing their prisoners and preparing for the journey down the mountain, Sarah found herself alone with Brandon for a few moments. He was still conscious, still fighting, but she could see the toll that his injuries were taking. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For believing in me when no one else would, for risking your life to protect me." Brandon's hand found hers, his grip weak but warm. "Thank you for reminding me what it means to have something worth fighting for." The words hit her like a physical blow, cutting through all the fear and uncertainty of the past few hours to touch something deep in her chest. She had spent so long thinking of herself as a burden, as someone who brought trouble to everyone she encountered. But Brandon saw her differently, saw her as someone worth protecting, worth standing with against impossible odds. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we heal," Brandon replied. "Both of us, and then we figure out what comes next." Sarah squeezed his hand gently, careful not to aggravate his injuries. "Together?" "If you'll have me," he said. "I know I'm not much of a catch. Hermit living alone on a mountain, more comfortable with trees than people. But if you're willing to take a chance on someone like me." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy rather than despair. "I think I'd like that," she said. "I think I'd like that very much." Daniel Hughes returned then, along with Ethan Lopez and several other men carrying a makeshift stretcher. "Time to go," Hughes said. "The sooner we get him to a doctor, the better his chances." As they carefully lifted Brandon onto the stretcher, Sarah stayed close beside him, her hand never leaving his. The journey down the mountain would be difficult, and the road to recovery even more challenging. But for the first time in months, she felt hope rather than despair, felt the possibility of a future that held something more than mere survival. The truth had come out, just as Brandon had promised it would. Marcus Whitmore's crimes were exposed, Christopher Scott and his men were in custody, and she was no longer a fugitive running from a justice system that had been manipulated against her. But more than that, she had found something she had never expected to find: a partner, someone who saw her not as a burden or a charity case, but as an equal, someone worth standing with against whatever challenges the future might bring. As they emerged from the mine into the afternoon sunlight, Sarah looked back once at the dark opening in the mountainside where so much had been decided. Then she turned her face toward the valley below, toward Pine Creek and the doctor who would help Brandon heal, toward a future that was uncertain but no longer hopeless. The bread she had stolen from his porch seemed like a lifetime ago, a desperate act by a woman who had believed she had no other options. Now she knew better. There were always options, always choices to be made, always the possibility of finding someone willing to stand with you when the darkness closed in. She squeezed Brandon's hand gently as they began the descent, and felt him squeeze back, a silent promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and approaching winter, but Sarah no longer felt the cold. She had found warmth in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected person, and she was determined never to let it go. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Marcus Whitmore was still at large, still desperate to cover his tracks. Christopher Scott's men had been captured, But there might be others, other hired guns willing to kill to keep the truth buried. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she remembered the federal marshal's words about interstate commerce and money laundering, about crimes that reach far beyond their small mountain community. How deep did this conspiracy go? How many people were involved? And what would they be willing to do to protect themselves when they learned that their carefully constructed web of lies was beginning to unravel? As they reached the bottom of the trail and began loading Brandon into a wagon for the journey to town, Sarah caught sight of a rider approaching from the direction of Pine Creek. The man was riding hard, his horse lathered with sweat, and there was something in his posture that spoke of urgent news. "Marshal," the rider called as he drew near. "Marshal Patterson." One of the federal marshals stepped forward. "What is it, deputy?" "It's Whitmore," the rider gasped, his chest heaving from the hard ride. "He's gone. Disappeared sometime this morning, along with most of his cash and all his records. The store's been cleaned out." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as the implications sank in. Marcus Whitmore was still out there, still free, still dangerous. And now he knew that his conspiracy had been exposed, that federal marshals were closing in on him. "How much of a head start does he have?" Marshal Patterson demanded. 6 hours, maybe more. Could be anywhere by now. Sarah looked down at Brandon, who was listening to this exchange with obvious concern despite his weakened condition. Their ordeal was far from over, she realized. In fact, it might just be beginning. Marcus Whitmore was a desperate man now, with nothing left to lose and everything to gain by silencing the witnesses who could testify against him. He had already proven he was willing to kill to protect his secrets. What would he do now that those secrets were fully exposed? As the wagon began to move toward Pine Creek, carrying Brandon toward the medical attention he desperately needed, Sarah found herself scanning the tree line, watching for any sign of movement, any indication that they were being followed. The truth had come out, but the price of that truth might be higher than any of them had imagined. And somewhere out there in the vast wilderness of the mountain country, Marcus Whitmore was planning his next move, preparing for one final, desperate attempt to escape justice. Sarah squeezed Brandon's hand tighter, drawing strength from his presence, even as she worried about his condition. Whatever came next, whatever dangers still lay ahead, she would face them with the same courage and determination that had carried her this far. She had survived poverty and hunger, false accusations and hired killers. She had found love in the most unlikely circumstances, with a man who had seen past her desperate circumstances to the strength that lay beneath. Now she would fight to protect that love, to preserve the future they had begun to build together. Marcus Whitmore and his conspirators had taken enough from her already. They would not take this. The wagon rolled on toward Pine Creek, carrying its precious cargo toward safety and healing. But Sarah knew that the real test was still to come, that the final confrontation with the forces that had tried to destroy her was yet to be fought. She was ready for it. The wagon wheels creaked against the frozen ground as they descended toward Pine Creek, each jolt sending fresh waves of pain through Brandon's body. Sarah kept her hand pressed against his wounds, feeling the warmth of his blood seeping through the makeshift bandages, watching his face grow paler with each passing mile. The federal marshals rode alongside them, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of Marcus Whitmore or his remaining associates. Dr. Sandra Patel was waiting for them at her clinic, having been alerted by a rider sent ahead from the mining camp. She was a small woman with steady hands and intelligent eyes, one of the few female physicians in the territory who had earned her reputation through skill rather than sentiment. She took one look at Brandon's condition and immediately began barking orders to her assistant. "Get him inside, quickly. I need hot water, clean bandages, and my surgical instruments. This man has lost too much blood." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions under pressure. Sarah tried to follow as they carried Brandon into the clinic, but Dr. Patel stopped her at the door. "You'll only be in the way. Let me work." "Please," Sarah said, her voice breaking, "I need to know he's going to be all right." Dr. Patel's expression softened slightly as she took in Sarah's torn dress, her scraped hands, the desperate look in her eyes. "I'll do everything I can, but he needs surgery, and he needs it now. The next few hours will tell us whether he survives this." The door closed between them, leaving Sarah alone in the waiting room with Marshall Patterson and Deputy Hughes. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of medical activity, the clink of instruments, the low murmur of voices as Dr. Patel worked to save Brandon's life. "He's strong," Hughes said quietly. "If anyone can pull through this, it's Brandon Wright." Sarah nodded, but she couldn't shake the image of Brandon throwing himself between her and Christopher Scott's rifle, taking a bullet that had been meant for her. He had saved her life at the cost of his own, and now she could only wait and pray that his sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. Marshall Patterson was studying a map spread across a small table, marking locations with a pencil as he coordinated the search for Marcus Whitmore. He's got a 6-hour head start, but he's traveling alone and on foot. Can't have gotten far in this terrain. Unless he had help, Hughes pointed out. Someone with fresh horses, supplies, a plan. "That's what I'm afraid of," Patterson admitted. "Whitmore's been running this operation for years. He's got to have contacts, people who owe him favors or who are in too deep to let him get caught." Sarah listened to their conversation with growing unease. Even if Brandon survived his injuries, even if they managed to capture Marcus Whitmore, how could she ever feel safe again? How many other people were involved in this conspiracy? How many other hired killers might be out there waiting for their chance to silence the witnesses who could bring down the entire network? The clinic door opened and Dr. Patel emerged, her surgical gown stained with blood. Sarah's heart stopped as she waited for the verdict, unable to read anything from the physician's composed expression. "He's alive," Dr. Patel said finally. "The surgery went well and I was able to remove both bullets and repair most of the damage. But he's lost a great deal of blood and his body has been through tremendous trauma. The next 24 hours will be critical." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. "Can I see him?" "He's unconscious and he needs rest. But yes, you can sit with him for a few minutes." Sarah followed Dr. Patel into the back room, where Brandon lay motionless on a narrow bed, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. His face was pale as parchment, but there was color in his lips, and his breathing seemed steady. She took his hand in hers, careful not to disturb the bandages that covered his shoulder and chest. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Dr. Patel checked his pulse, then adjusted the blankets covering him. "He's fortunate to have someone who cares about him. That kind of support can make all the difference in recovery." "He saved my life," Sarah said. "More than once. I owe him everything." "From what I've heard, the debt goes both ways," Dr. Patel replied. "Marshall Patterson told me what happened on there, how you stood with him against impossible odds. That takes courage." Sarah looked down at Brandon's still face, remembering the moment when he had thrown himself between her and Christopher Scott's rifle. "He's the one with courage. I was just trying not to get killed." "Sometimes that's the same thing," Dr. Patel said gently. "Sometimes survival itself is an act of courage." A commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Voices raised in alarm and the sound of horses arriving at speed. Marshall Patterson burst through the clinic door, his face grim with urgency. "We've got trouble," he announced. "Whitmore's been spotted 3 miles north of town, but he's not alone. Looks like he's got at least 6 men with him, all armed." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. "He's coming here." "That's what we think. He knows you're the key witness against him, and he knows Wright can corroborate your story. With both of you dead, his word becomes as good as anyone else's." Dr. Patel moved protectively closer to Brandon's bed. "This man cannot be moved. Any attempt to transport him in his current condition could kill him." "Then we make our stand here," Marshall Patterson said. "Hughes, get word to Sheriff Morrison. Tell him we need every available man. Lopez, start barricading the windows and doors. We're going to turn this clinic into a fortress." Sarah looked down at Brandon, so still and vulnerable in his hospital bed, then back at the marshal. "What can I do?" "Can you shoot?" "Yes." "Then you can help us defend this place." Patterson handed her a rifle from the rack by the door. "Whitmore's made this personal. He's not going to stop until you're dead, or he is." As the men began preparing their defenses, Sarah took her position by the window that offered the best view of the main street. The afternoon sun was slanting low through the glazas, casting long shadows across the wooden floors of the clinic. Somewhere out there, Marcus Whitmore was preparing for his final desperate gamble, gathering his remaining allies for one last attempt to silence the witnesses who could destroy him. Sarah thought about the bread she had stolen from Brandon's porch, the simple act of desperation that had set all of this in motion. If she had known then what she knew now, would she have made the same choice? Would she have risked not just her own life, but the life of the man who had shown her kindness when she needed it most? The answer came to her with surprising clarity. Yes, because that choice had led her to Brandon, had shown her what it meant to have someone willing to stand with her against impossible odds. Whatever happened in the next few hours, whatever price they might have to pay for the truth, it was worth it for the chance to build something real together. Sarah, Dr. Patel said quietly, moving to check on Brandon's condition. There's something you should know about his injuries. Sarah turned from the window, her heart clenching with sudden fear. What is it? The damage to his shoulder was extensive. Even if he recovers fully, he may never regain full use of that arm. His life as a woodsman, living alone in the mountains, that may be over. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Brandon's entire identity was tied to his self-sufficiency, his ability to survive in the wilderness through his own skill and strength. If he could no longer live that life, what would become of him? He'll need someone to help him, Dr. Patel continued. Someone to care for him during his recovery, and perhaps beyond. Are you prepared for that responsibility? Sarah looked down at Brandon's still face, at the man who had risked everything to protect her. Yes, she said without hesitation. Whatever he needs, whatever it takes. Patel nodded approvingly. Good, because he's going to need that kind of commitment to get through what's ahead. A shout from outside interrupted their conversation, and Sarah returned to her position by the window. In the distance, she could see riders approaching, moving at a steady pace that spoke of grim determination rather than haste. Marcus Whitmore was coming, and he was bringing an army with him. 6 men, Marshal Patterson reported, lowering his spyglass. All armed, all professional. Whitmore's not taking any chances this time. Sarah counted the defenders they had managed to assemble. Patterson and his deputy, Hughes and Lopez, Sheriff Morrison and 2 of his men, plus herself and Dr. Patel. 8 against 6, but the attackers had the advantage of mobility while the defenders were trapped in a building with a critically wounded man who couldn't be moved. What's the plan? Hughes asked. We hold them off until reinforcements arrive, Patterson said. I've sent word to the territorial capital. Federal agents are on their way, but they won't be here until tomorrow at the earliest. And if Whitmore doesn't want to wait that long, then we make him pay for every inch of ground he takes. The riders were closer now, close enough that Sarah could make out individual faces. Marcus Whitmore rode in the center of the group, his usually neat appearance disheveled, his face haggard with desperation and fear. The men around him were hard-faced strangers, the kind of professional killers who could be hired in any frontier town for the right price. They stopped just outside rifle range, and Whitmore dismounted, walking forward until he was close enough to be heard without shouting. Sarah Anderson, he called. I know you're in there. You've caused me enough trouble. Come out now, and I'll make this quick and clean. Go to hell, Whitmore, Patterson shouted back. You're surrounded and outgunned. Surrender now, and maybe you'll live to see trial. Whitmore laughed, a harsh sound that carried clearly in the still air. Outgunned? I don't think so, Marshal. You've got 8 people in there, including a woman and a wounded man. I've got 6 of the best shooters money can buy. The odds favor me. The odds favor justice, Patterson replied. And justice is coming for you, Whitmore, one way or another. Justice? Whitmore's voice rose with anger and desperation. Where was justice when I was trying to build something in this godforsaken territory? Where was justice when the banks were bleeding me dry, when the suppliers were demanding payment I didn't have? I did what I had to do to survive, just like everyone else. Sarah felt a flicker of understanding, even through her fear and anger. Marcus Whitmore wasn't just a criminal. He was a man who had been driven to desperate measures by circumstances beyond his control, just as she had been driven to steal bread from Brandon's porch. The difference was that Whitmore had chosen to hurt others to save himself, while she had tried to hurt no one but herself. "It doesn't have to end this way," she called out, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "You can still surrender. You can still do the right thing." "The right thing?" Whitmore's laugh was bitter now. "The right thing would have been for you to mind your own business, to take your punishment like a good little thief and let sleeping dogs lie. But you had to drag Brandon right into this, had to make him your champion. Now look where it's gotten you both." Sarah glanced back at Brandon, still unconscious on his hospital bed, his face pale but peaceful. "He chose to help me," she said. "No one forced him. He saw someone in need and he acted. That's what decent people do." "Decent people?" Whitmore spat. "Decent people don't steal money from hardworking shopkeepers. Decent people don't harbor fugitives. Decent people mind their own business and let the law handle criminals." "The law was being manipulated by you," Sarah replied. "You turned me into a scapegoat for your own crimes. You sent killers after innocent people. What's decent about that?" For a moment, Whitmore was silent, and Sarah thought she might have reached him, might have found some spark of conscience buried beneath his desperation and fear. But then his face hardened again, and she knew that whatever humanity he might once have possessed had been burned away by months of lies and violence. "Enough talk," he said. "You've got 5 minutes to send out Sarah Anderson and any evidence you might have against me. After that, we start shooting, and we don't stop until everyone in that building is dead." Marshal Patterson looked around at his small force of defenders, then back at Sarah. "It's your choice," he said quietly. "I won't force you to stay and fight. If you want to surrender, to try to negotiate with him." Sarah shook her head. "He's not interested in negotiation. He's here to kill witnesses, and he won't stop until we're all dead. We fight." Patterson nodded grimly. "Then we fight." The next few minutes passed in tense silence as both sides prepared for battle. Sarah checked her rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. Dr. Patel moved Brandon's bed away from the windows, then took her own position with a shotgun that looked incongruously large in her small hands. "I've never shot at another human being," the doctor said quietly. "Hopefully you won't have to," Sarah replied. "But if it comes to that, remember that they're here to kill an innocent man who can't defend himself." Dr. Patel nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Then I'll do what I have to do." The 5 minutes stretched into eternity, marked only by the steady tick of the clinic's wall clock and the sound of their own breathing. Sarah found herself thinking about her father, about his final words about survival and strength. She thought about Brandon, about the way he had looked at her when he called her his partner, about the future they might have together if they survived the next hour. Then Whitmore's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Time's up." The first shots shattered the afternoon quiet, bullets smashing through the clinic windows and splintering the wooden walls. Sarah ducked below the windowsill, then rose quickly to return fire, her rifle cracking as she aimed at the muzzle flashes in the street. The battle was fierce but brief, a concentrated exchange of gunfire that filled the air with smoke and the smell of cordite. Sarah saw one of Whitmore's men stagger and fall, clutching his chest, but the others pressed forward, using the buildings across the street for cover as they advanced on the clinic. "They're trying to flank us," Hughes shouted from his position by the side window. "Coming around the back." Sheriff Morrison and one of his deputies moved to cover the rear entrance, their boots heavy on the wooden floor as they took position. Sarah heard the crash of breaking glass from somewhere behind her, then the boom of Morrison's shotgun as he engaged targets she couldn't see. A bullet whined past her ear, close enough that she felt the wind of its passage, and she dropped below the windowsill again. When she rose to return fire, she saw Marcus Whitmore himself advancing across the street, a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. Their gazes met across the chaos of the battle, and Sarah saw something in his face that chilled her blood. This was no longer about money or evidence or legal consequences. This had become personal, a matter of pride and revenge that would only end with death. She took careful aim and squeezed the trigger, but Whitmore had already ducked behind a water trough, and her bullet sparked harmlessly off the metal rim. He rose and fired back, his shot shattering the window frame inches from her head. Sarah! Derpito's voice was sharp with alarm. He's moving! Sarah looked back and saw Brandon stirring on his hospital bed, his eyes fluttering open as the sound of gunfire penetrated his unconscious state. He tried to sit up, his face contorting with pain as the movement aggravated his wounds. Stay down, Sarah called to him. Don't try to move. But Brandon was already struggling to his feet, his face pale but his eyes alert and focused. Where's my rifle? He asked, his voice hoarse but determined. You can't fight, Dr. Patel protested. You'll tear open your wounds. You could bleed to death. I'll bleed to death anyway if Whitmore gets in here, Brandon replied. He spotted his rifle leaning against the wall and moved toward it, each step obviously costing him tremendous effort. Sarah wanted to go to him, to force him back into bed, but she couldn't abandon her position at the window. Whitmore and his men were pressing their attack, moving closer to the clinic with each exchange of gunfire. Brandon reached his rifle and checked the action, his movements automatic despite his obvious weakness. Then he moved to a window on the opposite side of the room, taking up a position that gave him a clear field of fire down the side street. Brandon, please, Sarah said. You're in no condition to fight. I'm in no condition to lie there helpless while the woman I love is in danger, he replied, and the words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The woman I love. He had said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But Sarah felt her heart stop, felt the world tilt on its axis as the full meaning of his words sank in. You love me? She asked, her voice barely audible above the sound of gunfire. Brandon looked at her across the smoke-filled room, his storm-gray eyes steady and sure, despite his physical weakness. I've loved you since the moment you stood up to those lawmen on my porch. Since you refused to let fear make you small. I love your courage, your strength, your refusal to give up even when everything seems hopeless. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. There would be time for tears later, time to explore the feelings that were blooming in her chest like flowers after a long winter. Right now, they had to survive. I love you too, she said, and the words felt like a prayer, like a promise, like a vow made in the face of impossible odds. Brandon smiled, the expression transforming his pale face. Then let's make sure we both live long enough to do something about it. The battle raged on around them, but Sarah felt as if she and Brandon were enclosed in a bubble of perfect understanding, connected by something deeper than words or circumstances. They fought side by side, covering each other's positions, communicating with glances and gestures that spoke of an intimacy born from shared danger and mutual trust. Marcus Whitmore's assault was beginning to falter. 2 of his men were down and the others were running low on ammunition. But Whitmore himself seemed possessed by a fury that transcended rational thought, exposing himself to enemy fire as he pressed forward with reckless determination. He's lost his mind, Marshal Patterson observed, ducking as another of Whitmore's wild shots shattered a lamp on the wall behind him. He's fighting like a man who doesn't expect to survive this. Sarah realized that Patterson was right. Whitmore wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to take as many of his enemies with him as possible. It was the most dangerous kind of opponent, someone with nothing left to lose and no concern for his own survival. We need to end this, she said, before someone gets killed. Someone's already going to get killed, Brandon replied grimly. The question is who? As if to prove his point, one of Whitmore's remaining men made a desperate charge toward the clinic's front door, firing wildly as he ran. Sheriff Morrison's shotgun boomed, and the man went down hard, his rifle spinning away across the wooden sidewalk. That left Whitmore with only 2 men, but he didn't seem to care. If anything, the loss of his allies seemed to make him more determined, more reckless in his assault on the clinic. Sarah Anderson, he screamed, his voice cracking with strain. This is all your fault. If you had just died quietly like you were supposed to, none of this would have happened. If you had just been honest about your debts, Sarah called back, none of this would have been necessary. Honest? Whitmore's laugh was the sound of a man on the edge of complete breakdown. Honesty is a luxury I couldn't afford. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch everything you've built crumble around you? To see your life's work destroyed by forces beyond your control? Despite everything he had done, despite the killers he had hired and the innocent people he had tried to murder. Sarah found herself feeling a flicker of sympathy for Marcus Whitmore. She knew what it was like to be desperate, to feel as if the world was crushing you beneath its weight. The difference was that she had found someone willing to help her carry that burden, while Whitmore had chosen to spread his suffering to others. "It doesn't have to end this way," she called out. "You can still surrender. You can still try to make things right." "Make things right?" Whitmore's voice was bitter with despair. "I'm a dead man walking, Sarah. Even if I surrender, even if I somehow avoid the gallows, I'll never be free. There are people involved in this conspiracy who won't let me live to testify against them. My only choice is to die fighting or die cowering. I choose to fight." With that, he rose from his position behind the water trough and charged directly toward the clinic, his rifle blazing as he came. Sarah saw him coming and took careful aim, but her shot went wide as one of his companions laid down covering fire that forced her to duck below the windowsill. Brandon's rifle cracked from across the room, and Sarah saw Whitmore stumble, clutching his shoulder. But he didn't go down, didn't stop his desperate charge toward the building where his enemies waited. "He's going for the door," Hughes shouted. Sarah ran toward the front entrance, arriving just as Whitmore burst through the doorway, his face twisted with pain and fury. They faced each other across the width of the clinic's main room, two people whose lives had become intertwined by chance and circumstance, whose fates would be decided in the next few seconds. "It's over, Marcus," Sarah said, her rifle trained on his chest. "Put down your weapon." Whitmore looked around the room, taking in the defenders who had their weapons pointed at him, the wounded man who had somehow found the strength to stand against him, the woman who had inadvertently brought down his entire criminal enterprise. "You're right," he said quietly. "It is over." But instead of dropping his rifle, he began to raise it towards Sarah, his finger tightening on the trigger. Sarah saw his intention and started to squeeze her own trigger, knowing that one of them would die in the next heartbeat. The shot that rang out came from neither of their weapons. Dr. Sandra Patel stood behind Marcus Whitmore, her small hands steady on the smoking barrel of her shotgun. Whitmore looked down at the spreading stain of blood on his chest, then back at the diminutive physician who had just ended his life. "You were threatening my patient," Dr. Patel said simply. Whitmore collapsed to his knees, then fell forward onto his face, his rifle clattering across the wooden floor. The sudden silence that followed was deafening after the chaos of the battle, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the distant shouts of Whitmore's remaining men as they fled into the wilderness. Sarah lowered her rifle, her hands shaking with reaction as the full impact of what had just happened sank in. Marcus Whitmore was dead, his conspiracy exposed, his hired killers scattered or captured. The nightmare that had begun with a few stolen dollars was finally over. But as she looked around the smoke-filled clinic, at the broken windows and bullet-scarred walls, at Brandon swaying on his feet as his strength finally gave out, she realized that the real work was just beginning. Dr. Patel was already moving toward Brandon, her medical training taking over as she assessed his condition. "Get him back to bed," she ordered. "He's torn open his wounds again. I need to operate immediately." Sarah helped support Brandon as they guided him back to his hospital bed, feeling the warmth of fresh blood soaking through his bandages. His face was gray with pain and exhaustion, but his eyes were alert and focused on her. "Is it really over?" he asked. "It's over," Sarah confirmed. "Whitmore's dead. His men are scattered. The federal marshals have all the evidence they need to round up the rest of his associates." Brandon nodded weakly, then reached out to take her hand. "What happens now?" Sarah looked down at their joined hands, at the man who had risked everything to protect her, who had declared his love for her in the midst of a battle for their lives. She thought about Dr. Patel's warning about his injuries, about the long recovery ahead, about the uncertain future they would face together. "Now we heal," she said, echoing his words from the mine. "Both of us. And then we figure out what comes next." "Together?" "Together," she confirmed. "If you'll have me. I know I'm not much of a catch, a woman with no family, no money, no prospects. But if you're willing to take a chance on someone like me—" Brandon squeezed her hand gently, his grip weak but warm. "I think I'd like that," he said, using her own words from the mine. "I think I'd like that very much." Dr. Patel cleared her throat impatiently. This is all very touching, but this man needs surgery. Now, Miss Anderson, you can continue your courtship after I've saved his life. Sarah squeezed Brandon's hand one more time, then stepped back to let the doctor work. As she watched Dr. Patel prepare her instruments, she felt a strange sense of peace settling over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. The bread she had stolen from Brandon's porch seemed like something from another lifetime, a desperate act by a woman who had believed she had no other options. Now she knew better. There were always options, always choices to be made, always the possibility of finding someone willing to stand with you when the darkness closed in. Marshall Patterson approached her as Dr. Patel began her work on Brandon's wounds. There'll be paperwork, he said, testimony to give, statements to sign. The federal investigation is far from over. I understand, Sarah said. I'll do whatever needs to be done. And after that? Sarah looked at Brandon, unconscious now under Dr. Patel's ministrations, his face peaceful despite the trauma his body had endured. After that, we build something new, something better than what we had before. Patterson nodded approvingly. He's a good man, Brandon, right? Stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery, but good. You could do worse. I could do a lot worse, Sarah agreed. As the afternoon faded into evening, Sarah kept her vigil beside Brandon's bed, holding his hand and listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Dr. Patel had pronounced the surgery a success, though she warned that his recovery would be long and difficult. Outside, the town of Pine Creek was returning to normal after the excitement of the day. The broken windows of the clinic had been boarded up, the blood had been scrubbed from the wooden floors, and the bodies of Marcus Whitmore and his men had been removed by the undertaker. But inside the clinic, in the quiet space beside Brandon's bed, Sarah felt as if she was witnessing the birth of something new and precious. Not just her relationship with Brandon, but her own transformation from a desperate woman stealing bread to survive into someone capable of love and partnership and hope. 3 days later, Brandon was finally strong enough to sit up in bed and take solid food. His left arm was still immobilized in a sling, and Dr. Patel had warned him that he might never regain full use of it, but his color was returning, and his strength was slowly building. Sarah had barely left his side during those 3 days, sleeping in a chair beside his bed, helping Dr. Patel with his care, talking to him during the long hours when pain made sleep impossible. They had talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their pen, dreams for their future, the kind of intimate conversations that bonded two souls together in ways that went deeper than mere attraction. I've been thinking, Brandon said as Sarah helped him eat his breakfast, about what comes next. And I can't go back to living alone on the mountain, not with this arm, not with the way things have changed between us. I need to find a new way to make a living, a new way to be useful. Sarah set down the spoon she had been using to feed him soup and looked into his storm-gray eyes. What did you have in mind? Pine Creek's growing. They're going to need more buildings, more furniture, more of the things that skilled craftsmen can provide. I may not be able to swing an axe like I used to, but I can still work with wood, still create things with my hands. You want to become a carpenter? I want to become whatever this town needs me to become. And I want to do it with you beside me, if you're willing. Sarah felt her heart swell with love and pride for this man who refused to let his injuries define his future, who was already planning the ways to contribute to the community that had sheltered them in their time of need. What would I do? She asked. I don't have any particular skills, any trade or profession. You have the most important skill of all, Brandon replied. You know how to survive. You know how to keep going when everything seems hopeless. That's a skill this territory needs more than any other. Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Patel entered the room carrying a telegram that had just arrived from the territorial capital. Her expression was serious as she handed the message to Sarah. It's from the federal marshals, she said, about the investigation. Sarah unfolded the telegram and read it quickly, her eyes widening as she took in the contents. They've arrested 12 people in connection with Marcus Whitmore's conspiracy, she said, including 2 territorial officials and a federal judge. How deep did this thing go? Brandon asked. Deeper than anyone imagined, Sarah replied, continuing to read. They were using Whitmore's store as a front for money laundering, smuggling, and fraud. The stolen money I was accused of taking was just the tip of the iceberg. Dr. Patel shook her head in amazement. To think that all of this started with a few dollars missing from a cash drawer. It didn't start there, Sarah said quietly. It started with desperation. Mine, Whitmore's, all the people who got caught up in this web of lies and violence. Desperation makes people do things they never thought they were capable of. Good things and bad things, Brandon added. Your desperation led you to steal bread, but it also led you to me. Whitmore's desperation led him to embezzlement and murder. Sarah nodded, understanding the deeper truth he was expressing. Circumstances didn't determine character. They revealed it. When faced with impossible choices, some people chose to hurt others to save themselves, while others chose to bear the burden alone rather than spread their suffering. There's more, she said, returning to the telegram. The territorial governor is offering a reward for our testimony, enough money to help us get started in whatever new life we choose to build. How much? Brandon asked. $500. Dr. Patel whistled softly. That's more than most people in this territory see in 5 years. Sarah looked at Brandon, seeing the same thought reflected in his eyes. $500 was enough to buy land, to build a house, to start a business. It was enough to transform their dreams into reality, to give them the foundation they needed to build a life together. What do you think? She asked. I think, Brandon said slowly, that sometimes good things come from bad situations. Sometimes the worst day of your life leads to the best day of your life. Sarah leaned down and kissed him gently, tasting the promise of their future on his lips. Sometimes stealing bread from a mountain man's porch turns out to be the smartest thing you ever did. Brandon laughed, the sound rich and warm despite his weakness. Sometimes getting caught by a desperate woman turns out to be the luckiest thing that ever happened to a lonely hermit. Dr. Patel cleared her throat diplomatically. I hate to interrupt this touching moment, but I have other patients to attend to. Mr. Wright, you're healing well, but you still need several more days of rest before you can even think about leaving this clinic. I'm not going anywhere, Brandon assured her, and I've got everything I need right here. As Dr. Patel left them alone, Sarah settled back into her chair beside Brandon's bed, taking his good hand in both of hers. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but no longer frightening, full of possibilities that neither of them could have imagined just a week ago. What do you want to do first? She asked. When you're well enough to leave here? First, Brandon said, I want to marry you. Properly, in front of the whole town, with a preacher and flowers and everything you deserve. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but this time they were tears of part rather than sorrow. Is that a proposal? That's a proposal, Brandon confirmed. I know I should get down on one knee, but under the circumstances are perfect, Sarah interrupted. And yes, Brandon Wright, I will marry you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands intertwined, watching the afternoon sunlight stream through the clinic windows. Outside, the town of Pine Creek went about its daily business, unaware that two of its newest residents were planning a future that would make them part of its growing community. After we're married, Brandon continued, I want to buy some land on the edge of town. Build us a house with my own hands, even if it takes twice as long with this bum arm. I want to start a carpentry business, maybe take on an apprentice or two. And I want to help, Sarah said, however I can. Maybe I could keep the books, handle the business side of things. I learned a lot about numbers and accounts helping my father with the farm. Partners, Brandon said, echoing the word that had become so important to both of them. Partners, Sarah agreed, in everything. As the sun began to set outside the clinic windows, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The path from desperation to hope, from isolation to love, from theft to redemption, had been neither straight nor easy. But every step had been necessary. Every choice had led her closer to the life she was meant to live. The bread she had stolen from Brandon's porch had been more than just food. It had been the key that unlocked a door she hadn't even known existed. Behind that door lay not just survival, but transformation, not just rescue, but partnership, not just safety, but love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove themselves worthy of the second chance they had been given. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of the clinic, with Brandon's hand warm in hers and their future spreading before them like an uncharted territory waiting to be explored, Sarah Anderson felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. She felt hope. And in that hope, she found the strength to believe that sometimes, when you have nothing left to lose, you discover that you have everything to gain. Sometimes the worst mistake of your life becomes the first step toward the best decision you ever made. Sometimes stealing bread from a mountain man's porch is exactly what you need to do to find your way home. The mountain wind whispered through the pine trees outside the clinic, carrying the scent of approaching winter and the promise of spring beyond. Sarah squeezed Brandon's hand gently and settled back in her chair, ready to face whatever the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that she would not face it alone. They were partners now, bound together by shared trials and mutual trust, by love tested in the crucible of violence and desperation and found to be stronger than fear. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them together, just as they had met the darkness and emerged into the light. The bread was long gone, consumed in a moment of desperate hunger. But what it had purchased, what it had made possible, would last a lifetime and beyond. Sarah closed her eyes and smiled, listening to the steady rhythm of Brandon's breathing, feeling the warmth of his hand in hers, dreaming of the house they would build together on the edge of Pine Creek, of the children they might raise, of the life they would create from the ashes of their separate despairs. It was a good dream, worth fighting for, worth the price they had paid to make it possible. And as the stars emerged in the darkening sky above the mountain town, two souls who had found each other in the wilderness began to plan their journey toward tomorrow, together.